Thanks, Fee. Good morning, everyone. It's great to hear Mick read the passage just then. And this is slightly weird because, as Fee mentioned, I work at St. Luke's School, which is just down the road. And it's very similar to Isca. So I feel this is normally like an assembly setting for me. So I'm sorry if I talk to you like you're 12-year-olds. Or if I tell you off about the litter in the playground or anything like that. But the good thing about assemblies with kids is that if they're bored or you're boring them, you know quite quickly because they start like flicking things around the room. But if they're engaged, it's really obvious they're engaged. So hopefully it'll be obvious that we're engaged this morning. I'm going to start with Kung Fu Panda. So I'm hoping, there we go. Freddie, my son at the moment, is obsessed with Kung Fu Panda. I'm not quite sure how or why. I think Kung Fu Panda 4 came out in the cinema and he saw the advert and he realised he used to watch Kung Fu Panda 1 years ago. And so we've had to watch Kung Fu Panda 2 and 3 at home in the last week so that hopefully we can see Kung Fu Panda 4 before it goes to the cinema. Can you just put your hand up if you've seen Kung Fu Panda? Right, here's the test. Keep your hand up if you've seen Kung Fu Panda 2. Keep your hand up if you've seen number 3. Keep your hand up if you've seen number 4. Who's left standing? No one. Oh, no one. None of us have seen number 4. Well, none of us can spoil it for anyone else. That's good. But if you've seen one of the Kung Fu Pandas, Po the panda is feeling a bit insecure because he finds out that his dad, Mr. Ping, who's a duck, isn't actually his dad. So I don't think it's a massive spoiler if you haven't seen it. But the second film is all about like his sort of journey really to find inner peace, to find out like who he really is. And at the start of the film, he's questioning like when he finds that out, well, who am I if I'm not who I thought I was? And we'll come back to Po a little bit later. I'm not sure how I'm going to make this link, but we're going to do it. On the theme of insecurity and perhaps more seriously, there's a book recently, which I haven't actually read, but some of you might have done, which Dan mentioned to me, by a sociologist called Jonathan Haidt. And he talks about us at the moment as being the anxious generation, and in particular, younger people being an anxious generation. And so we laugh about insecurity in Kung Fu Panda and Po, but we know it's a real theme. We talk about anxiety and insecurity at school, perhaps more than anything else when we think about our pastoral program. We know it amongst adults as well. The UN did a report in 2022. It showed 6 out of 7 people who responded were plagued by feelings of insecurity. And they found that people benefiting, interestingly, from some of the highest levels of wealth, health, and education around the world experienced even greater anxiety than previously. And with that, they said there was a strong link between increasing levels of insecurity and declining levels of trust in relationships between people. So this theme of insecurity and anxiety and where do we find our comfort and kind of where our security is a real theme at the moment. And I said, I know that in school for young people, we could talk about social media, we could talk about all sorts of things, but we think about people in their jobs, like trying to impress your boss, or trying to please your customers, or trying to please your followers and social leaders, or church leaders trying to impress their congregation, or people preaching trying to impress the people they're talking to. Like there's so many things where we could think about people feeling anxious and worried about what other people think about them. And so the claim that I think this passage makes this morning is that what we're about to read and what Mick read so brilliantly just now is the only basis for true security in the world. The only basis for proper, solid security and assurance. Dave mentioned last week, we've been reading through Romans and unpacking Romans, and this chapter 8, is like the pinnacle of the mountain. And I think these 3 verses in the middle of chapter 8 are probably the top of the mountain, if you like, as well. J.I. Packer, who's a Christian theologian and writer, said, if you want to judge how well a person understands Christianity, find out what they make about what we're about to read. He said, if this doesn't control your worship, your prayers, and your whole outlook on life, it means you don't understand Christianity very well. In other words, this is really important. Understanding this is central to understanding what Christianity is all about and what the New Testament is all about. So if you're exploring what Christianity is all about, I'm really glad you get to hear this bit today. It's humbling and a privilege just to get to speak about it. And if you count yourself a Christian, I hope that we can understand the magnitude of this more this morning and wonder at it in a new way as well. So we're going to read this passage again from Romans 8. I think it's worth reading twice. If you've got a Bible or your phone, it'd be great if you could have it open in front of you throughout the next 20 minutes or so, because I'll refer back to it. So it's Romans 8, and we're going to start at Romans 8, we're going to start at verse 14 in a second. Just before this, we've been reminded about the Spirit of life. So what Dave preached on last week about how we live by the Spirit, we will have life. And the theme of this is then about the Spirit of adoption. So it says, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the Spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. We're going to look at two main things from this passage, and the first is that we are sons of God. And I think the first thing we need to do is just unpack the idea of God as a father, which is who he is. And there's a lot of debate about what a good dad looks like. I watched recently How to Be a Man, which Danny Dyer did, which is a really, I'd really recommend it. He talks about what does it mean to be male at the moment? There's all sorts of things, and you might have heard of Andrew Tate online and kind of toxic masculinity, and he's putting out some pretty horrible stuff and misogynistic stuff online. But Danny Dyer was sort of unpacking this. There's not much positive stuff. When we tell boys in school how not to be, but we don't give them loads of positive examples of how to be. And part of it was what does a good dad look like? And he unpacks that question with some different men in this. And, we're really, really blessed. And as I was thinking about this, there's loads of examples of good fathering in our church. So we were hanging out with some friends yesterday for Lydia Pennell's birthday. And there's loads of examples of good fathering. Scott Pennell, if you know, at one point was up the trees with the kids, climbing with them. I saw Ali, neither of them here this morning, so I can embarrass them. Ali Brown, at one point, one of their daughters, did something they shouldn't have done, but he didn't yell at her. He took her to the side and gently explained why it was wrong and how she needed to go and apologise, and she did. James Kimber is not my dad, but he has been an amazing kind of father figure, really. If you want to go and talk to someone about work and how you what it means to be a Christian in the workplace and stuff, don't pay for a coach or someone. Just go and have coffee with James for half an hour. And it's amazing. There's so many good examples of good fathers in our church. And those examples reflect a little bit of what God is like. God is not like us. Those good examples reflect a tiny bit of how good God is as a father. And I know this can be really difficult for some people. I appreciate, and I think it's important we acknowledge this will be difficult for some of us. Some people won't have had good examples of a father or good experiences of a father. Some of us will be aware of our own failings as a dad as well. As I was ironically, as I was preparing this, I was getting frustrated with, I won't say which of our children, but they like, one of them tells stories, and then the story, you know, a story should have like a mountain, like there's a problem, and then like you fix the problem, then it ends. Like the stories like have a problem, and then there's another problem, that gets fixed, and then there's another problem, and like this story just kind of carries on. And I got a bit impatient and frustrated. God is never like that. He never gets impatient. He's never harsh. He's never absent. He's never emotionally distant. Like, God is good and loving, always kind, always faithful, always joyful, always good as a father, as a dad. And it's in his DNA. Like, he didn't become a father when he adopted us as children, which is what Paul writes about in Romans. Like, God has been a father forever. God as Trinity, as the Father, Son, and Spirit, have existed forever. And we could go on for a big tangent now. I would just like to recommend one book, which is really good. I think Hugh lent it to me. In fact, it was Hugh, wasn't it, Hugh? Yeah. It was. Called Overflow by Mike Reeves, where he talks about God as Trinity, including God as a father. And he's always been a good father. From before the world began, like, God the Father loved God the Son. And that's pictured at Jesus' baptism, when Jesus rises out of the water and the Spirit descends on him, and God the Father says, "This is my Son with whom I am pleased." God is a father. That's who he is within the Trinity. And we'll talk more about this in a minute, but I think that's unique to what we believe as Christians as well. So God is a father. Second bit from the first part of the passage is about adoption. And Paul says the way that people have become children of God is they've received the spirit of adoption. And again, a number of us might have experienced adoption in some different way, and there's some amazing examples of people in our own congregation who have adopted children. But what I would just want us to do is go back to what this meant at the time when Paul was writing it. So in a minute, we're going to go back and think about what that meant in Roman culture at the time, about 2,000 years ago. But first of all, back to Kung Fu Panda for a moment, because otherwise it will start to sound like one of my history lessons. What Poe realizes at the end of Kung Fu Panda 2, and he calls Mr. Ping his dad, because he realizes the important thing was that Mr. Ping chose to bring him up. So when Poe was left as a baby panda, Mr. Ping chose to take him in, and he wanted to bring Poe up as his son. And Poe realizes that that was the most important thing. And the word that Paul uses for adoption here is a specific word for what happened in Roman culture. And it was quite unusual, actually, so it didn't really happen in Jewish culture so much before. But in Roman culture, it wasn't that uncommon for people to adopt. And we'll talk about more what it means. On the screen, there are going to appear some pictures of some Roman emperors. Now, challenge. Put your hand up if you think you know. Does anyone know much about Romans and Roman emperors? Is anyone interested? Oh, great. Oh, a couple of you. Because I don't know much either, right? And this is a problem as a history teacher, is that there's quite a lot of history. So, Dan's a historian as well. Sometimes you talk to people and they're like, "Oh, you're a history teacher. I love the Romans." And I'm like, I don't really know anything about the Romans, like Julius Caesar. And then they start to talk to me, and I have to nod along and pretend I know stuff. So there's four, I don't know, shout out if you know any Roman emperors. Anyone have a guess at who these four are? Nero is one of them. Brilliant. Nero is one. Augustus is one. Heard that. Julius isn't up there. Caligula. We got 3. There's one more. Tiberius. Well done, Val. Excellent. We got all 4. Next question. What do you think all these 4 Roman emperors have in common? They're all... A lot of them were assassinated as well. Yeah. They were all adopted. So what happened often in Roman culture was, so for example, Augustus was adopted by Julius Caesar. So it wouldn't be uncommon for someone like Julius Caesar to decide, they had this male relative, perhaps a nephew or something, or just a kind of a young man of good standing who they thought would be a good leader, and they would adopt them. And when they adopted them, they were saying they were choosing them. They wanted them to be their heir. They wanted them to take power when they died. And when they did that, they inherited everything. So all their debts were wiped. They would have been paid by their dad. They took on everything that belonged to their father. They became like the firstborn son, basically. And so at that point, it's why it says sons in the passage. At this point, it was the firstborn son who inherited everything, who got all the rights. And so what it meant in Roman culture was if you were adopted, you took on a new status. You sort of left all your old problems and any debts you had, they were all cancelled, and you became the heir. You became the firstborn son, and all the rights and all the inheritance that came with that. And here's the best bit. The third thing then, this is what Paul says has happened for us. So he says, we've received a spirit not of slavery, but the spirit of adoption as children. When you choose to follow Jesus, receive the Spirit and live by the Spirit, not in our own flesh or in our own strength, then you receive the spirit of adoption who confirms that you are a child of God. You get all the rights of the firstborn son. And this idea of being adopted as children instead of living as a spirit of slavery is different, I think, to any other belief that I've learned about. Like I teach some RE as well. I've learned quite a lot about different beliefs and worldviews and religions, and I haven't really seen this anywhere else. This is different to following rules and guidelines that a God sets. This is different to like worshipping a set of values. Like there's lots of good values in the UK at the moment. Like, you know, the British values we teach about are like democracy, rule of law, respecting equality and rights. They're all good things. This is different to that because at the heart of it is a relationship. And not just a relationship, but a parent-child relationship. And more than that, somehow, and we won't fully understand this, we get caught up in the Trinity. So as God relates to his son, Jesus, we are brothers and sisters with Jesus. God speaks the same words over you that he spoke over Jesus' baptism. Like, you're my child. With you I am well pleased. Not because of what you've done, but because of what Jesus did to make that possible. So Jesus was the firstborn of many sons. We'll think more about that later in Romans 8. And it almost goes right back to the promise God gave to Abraham as well. God said to Abraham, your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky. And the sons of God, or the children of God, are as many as the stars in the sky. We are now grafted in and part of those stars in the sky. So the fact that we've been adopted as children explains why God's Spirit gives us life, and explains why we can be heirs with a glorious future. And that enables us to put suffering into perspective as well. I'm not going to talk that much about today because Paul unpacks the rest of that in the rest of Romans chapter 8. So that last little bit, suffering with Christ and being glorified with him, we'll unpack more of that in the next part in Romans 8. But, you know, do we appreciate how good this is? This goes even further than just no condemnation. This is adoption. Again, to go back to J.I. Packer, he says, everything that Christ taught, everything that makes the New Testament new and better than the Old, is summed up in the knowledge of the fatherhood of God. It's summed up in the fact that we call God Dad. For the second part of what we talk about, I just want to think about how can we be sure, and what does that mean? So 2 questions. First of all, how can we be sure? There's a picture will come up of a guy called Samuel Johnson, who you might have heard of. He wrote one of the first dictionaries. He probably didn't write the first dictionary. Like you realise when you teach history that most of the things that you think are true aren't actually true. Samuel Johnson was one of the first people to write a dictionary anyway. But I want to read you some quotes from his diaries. They're really interesting. Okay, so Samuel Johnson would have said he was a Christian and trying to follow God. But I just want to read you a few quotes. They're from about 300 years ago, but see if any of these sound familiar to you. In 1738, he wrote, "Help me, Lord, to lead a new life in thy faith, in fear and love, and finally to obtain everlasting life." 20 years later, he wrote, "Forgive me, I have misspent time. Help me to pass through things temporal so I don't lose things eternal." 4 years later, he wrote, "I have resolved again till I am afraid to resolve again. I resolve to avoid idleness, to regulate my sleep, to keep a journal, to study the scriptures, to read more of the Bible every week." 3 years later, he wrote, "I've made no more reformation. I have lived totally useless. More addicted to meat and wine. Help me, God, to change my life." The next year, he wrote, "I have spent now 55 years in resolving. I have done nothing. God, help me to resolve." He just said, "I spent 55, help me to resolve again. I resolve to rise early in the morning, no later than 6 if I can." Next year, "I resolve to rise at 8 because I struggle to rise at 6. But it shall be better than most days when I lie in until 2. And then 10 years later, "When I look back upon resolutions of improvement, year after year have been made and broken. Why do I try to resolve again? I keep trying in the hope of the help of God. I know that reformation is necessary and despair is criminal." And Mike Reeves, who wrote this book, says, "Isn't it tragic? 55 years of resolving and trying to do better, to be better, to read the Bible more, to pray more, to get up earlier, to be a nicer person." And they're not bad things, don't get me wrong. But it's so easy to try to do better, to do it in my own strength. And that's living by the flesh, which Dave talked about last week. And I don't know about you, but even as a Christian, it's so easy to think like that, to think, okay, God's done this thing that happened, and now it's down to me to try my best to live to please him and to live a good life. The way we live a good life is by knowing that he's put the Spirit in us and he's adopted us. The way we live a good life is by the Spirit, not by our own efforts and resolutions. And so in one sense this morning, this is about receiving, really, I think. This is about receiving the Spirit of adoption who's made us children of God. Someone external to ourselves tells us that this is true. And I think there's 3 ways the Spirit does this. The first one, he leads us to hate sin and put to death misdeeds. And this is what Dave spoke about last week, really. If you raised your hand last week, or if you thought in your heart, I want to live by the Spirit, not by the flesh, that is evidence that the Spirit is at work in your life in itself. Secondly, the Spirit is just the first fruits of inheritance to come. He reminds us of what is to come, and we'll see this more in the next bit of chapter 8. We groan inwardly as we await eagerly our full inheritance. We get glimpses of this, like in worship or when we're together. We get glimpses of what it's going to be like. But one day, the Spirit tells us we'll receive our inheritance fully. We'll be with God, the new heavens and new earth. And then thirdly, which I just want to dwell on to finish, is that the Spirit gives us security as children. Like the way children act around a house is very different to how servants would act around a house. Security means we're free from the fear of others. I had a look back. I sort of journal sometimes. Like I find like I'm better at writing stuff down sometimes than talking out loud. Kes will probably testify to that. So I was having a look back, and for me, like one of the biggest things in terms of like the fear of others is trying to appear competent all the time. I don't know if you can, if that resonates with you at all, or perhaps avoiding upsetting others, trying to look a certain way, whether that's to other people at work, whether it's to other people in church, like whether it's with your family, whether it's what you post online. But I think trying to appear together and like competent and able to do stuff really well is a really kind of common thing in our culture. So where I wonder is your security? Where do you find comfort? Where do you find reassurance? Is it being liked by others? Perhaps it's like in your financial status, perhaps it's in health. I don't know, but where for you is your security? As I said at the start, the claim that Paul makes here is that the only basis for security is in him, is in our status as children of God. And it means a couple of things. It means, first of all, when things go well, we can enjoy it freely, I think. That might seem like a bit of a funny application. But I was struck by this quite recently. Like when Freddie, for example, one of my sons, is doing something he really enjoys, acting out Kung Fu Panda probably. But when he's doing that and he's in it and he's loving it at the moment, like, and you can see him thriving and happy and interacting well with others, I'm like, yes, it's really good. I feel with him, I love how that's going for him. And God feels the same for us. Like when you're doing what you're good at, I don't think I understood this properly. Some people use the quote, like Eric Liddell, who's a runner, which resonates a bit with me because I run quite a lot. And he says, when I run, I feel God's pleasure. But I don't think I really fully understood that. I think sometimes when we're doing things we enjoy, or like you're doing stuff you're good at, or you're having a really good time, there's sometimes a bit of us that, like, I don't know why, maybe it's just me, feels a bit guilty sometimes, or a bit like, oh, I should be struggling like Samuel Johnson through life trying to be better. Like, when you're thriving, when you're using like he gave you the gifts, when you're using those gifts and you're doing really well, like, God's like, yes, with you. He wants you to use them to bring him glory and to bring Jesus glory in the power of the Spirit. So we can enjoy things when they go well. But the second thing as well, like, is this is security and comfort when we're anxious or when we're overwhelmed as well. I was putting Jemima, our 2-year-old, to bed the other night, and she was like all over the place. I think it was probably a day she'd been at nursery, and she just went mental. Like some of you might know what it's like. And she was like shouting and screaming, "I want mummy! I want to do this! I want, I don't know, I want biscuits! I want that! Blah blah blah." And then she was like literally almost crying uncontrollably in bed, and then suddenly. Kind of out of nowhere, we do these snuggle time prayers with her sometimes, which are really good. And without, like, I did nothing. I was a bit, I had nothing at that point. What can I do? Apart from stand there. And then she just, out of nowhere, started reciting to herself. We've done this one loads. She was like, "God, you made me wonderful, only one of me. Every single day I live, your precious child I'll be." And she repeated that about 3 times, and then she went to sleep. Like, it was, doesn't happen very often, like, but that, so I don't, in some way, like, that comforted her in the moment, and she went to sleep. And in the same way, like, when we're a bit all over the place, or we're tired, or we feel overwhelmed by a situation. It might be something in our family, like it might be something at work. It might just be the amount of stuff, like the daily stuff to do, like around the house and jobs and bills to pay and whatever. Like when we're anxious or overwhelmed, the Spirit testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. And it says here, the Spirit leads us to cry, Abba, Father. And do you know what? Perhaps dad or daddy is a better translation than father, because sometimes at the moment we can think father is a bit like, we don't use that word loads, do we? But the Spirit leads us to cry, Dad, just like Jesus did. Like Jesus cried out to his Father when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane before he went to the cross. And the word cry is like a spontaneous kind of cry with emotion. The Spirit can lead us to cry out to our Father. He can help us to do that when we most need it. And we need to grasp this, I think, before anything else. Like, we'll talk about suffering, I think, next week. But before anything else, we need to grasp this. Because when we have that, when we are secure in him as our Father, that can lead us to serve him and others in amazing ways. Like when Jesus washed his disciples' feet, the passage says, Jesus, knowing who he was, knowing who his Father was, got down and washed their feet. If we know who we are, we can serve him in amazing ways. The world needs followers of Jesus who are secure in who they are. Like, the world doesn't need people who are highly competent and impressive. The world doesn't need people who are always happy and optimistic. Like, the world doesn't need people who fully act out our Western values. The world needs people who are secure in who they are in God, who know they are loved as God's children, and who can point others to their dad in heaven. So let's pray for a minute, shall we? And ask the Spirit to do that now. Let's ask, that's what the passage says. It promises the Spirit points us to God. He testifies with our spirits. So why don't we stand together and I'll pray.